Check the stream. Excellent connection. And there's our stream. Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Kadava Vahayi Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvisha vahayi. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Welcome to you all. Welcome also to many who are watching this online. If you happen to be watching this live, happy Deepavali to you. Everyone is still celebrating, I think. We have a lot of great questions, as always. So I apologize in advance if we don't get to your question. And we'll also alternate, as we have, between online questions and questions here from our ashram students. Okay. First question is from Diego, who lives in Mexico. He's asked, my question is related to the question you've been asked so many times, and you mentioned in your last video, when did you become enlightened? And your answer seems perfect from me from the standpoint of ultimate reality. However, from the standpoint of vyavaharika satta, empirical life, it's not clear to me. So let's how to respond to the question, are you enlightened? Or more sarcastically, are you enlightened yet? So that question is loaded for various reasons. As I mentioned before, from a Vedantic standpoint, my true nature as Satchidananda Atma was never in a state of bondage, didn't need Vedanta in the first place, and therefore always enlightened. So that's one answer, and that's definitely from a very lofty standpoint. Then from a more empirical standpoint, vyavaharika satta, as Diego correctly says, enlightenment, how do we define enlightenment? Now that becomes quite complex. Is enlightenment the initial discovery of your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, or is enlightenment abiding in that truth without ever wavering? That absolute deep absorption, being completely resolved, having completely assimilated that. Those are two very different definitions. So if you ask me, when did you first discover your true nature as Satchidananda Atma? And long ago, back in the 1980s, when my study of Advaita Vedanta began, it becomes very clear. It doesn't. If you have proper teachings, and if you have the necessary preparation, it's not hard. That initial recognition, yes, it's true, my consciousness is unborn, uncreated, unchanging, and it is non-different from Brahman, the underlying reality because of which everything exists. That recognition is not, I would say, if that recognition didn't take place for me, that means that there's something wrong with these teachings. But these teachings are more than adequate. So absolutely, that recognition took place decades ago. This assimilation business is quite different. That is an ongoing process. And an ongoing process means some part of the process continues even now. One part of the process is over. Long ago I used to wonder, when will my mind finally abide in these teachings? And that used to cause me some frustration. Now I no longer worry about it because the mind is mind. What can you do? Mind is a human facet. It's as ordinary. My mind is as ordinary as body. My body. My body is full of defects. My mind is full of defects. I don't expect my body to be perfect. I certainly don't expect my mind to be perfect. So that was a huge leap for me, and that probably took place actually quite a while ago also. But beyond that, there's a process of assimilation that continues even today. So you can see how tricky that question is. Are you enlightened? It depends, first of all, who you mean by the one who gets enlightened, and secondly, what you mean by enlightenment. Anyway, so that's Diego's question. Next from Kartik, who lives in India. He asks, what is the difference between Vedantic meditation and yogic meditation? Vedantic meditation is what we call nididhyasana, and we often say it's contemplation, not meditation. And there are many, many kinds of nididhyasana, all of which are focused on that process of assimilation that I've just referred to. So Vedantic contemplation, nididhyasana, is a process of reflecting on what you've already discovered through self-inquiry, guided by these teachings, to reflect on that again and again, to reflect on what you've already discovered repeatedly for the sake of assimilation. That is nididhyasana. What's the difference between that and yogic meditation? Yogic meditation is hundreds of techniques, but what makes them all in one category is they're all concerned with directing your mind in a particular way. Control of the mind. Mano nigraha. Controlling the mind is the essence of all yogic meditation techniques. There are many, many, many. By the way, if you want to explore different kinds of meditation techniques, not for the sake of intellectual appreciation, but for the sake of practice. Many of you know that I have a course in meditation available on my YouTube channel. I think there are 42 individual lessons with many, many different techniques beyond even Vedantic meditation and yogic meditation. You can take a look at that. Also, which one is better? And this statement is a nice opportunity for an observation. Which is better, a hammer or a screwdriver? You get it. And that really is what it is. These different meditation techniques have different purposes. Obviously, if you have a loose screw, so to speak, you need the screwdriver. If there's a nail sticking out, you need a hammer. So the technique that's best depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And early on, there are certain introductory meditation techniques which are crucial to train your mind, to prepare your mind. And then later on, there are other techniques which are much more subtle, more so-called advanced techniques which you can practice. So in meditation techniques, we can't say one is best or one is better than the other. It really comes down to two factors. One I mentioned already, what are you trying to accomplish? There are different techniques for different goals. And secondly, and equally importantly, people have different inclinations. If there's a very, very powerful technique and you don't like it, you don't enjoy practicing it, then it's not for you. Because you have to be emotionally committed to that practice. You have to be excited about it and engaged in it. So no matter how powerful a technique is, unless it's appealing to you as an individual, it's not the right technique for you. So you can see how personal differences also play a role. So what is the best technique? Depends on what are you trying to accomplish, and secondly, what are your individual inclinations. Next question from Prashanto, who lives in Bangladesh. I am writing to let you know that the situation in Bangladesh for Hindus has gotten worse after the government was toppled last August by a mass movement. Now radicalism is taking its root in society, affecting the whole fabric of the harmony, and attacks on the minority Hindus in various forms are on the rise. I'm glad Prashanto is bringing this to our attention. I've actually I read a bunch of books and learned a little bit about the history of Bangladesh. It's brutal. When there was in the let me try to get the dates right. If I'm trying to remember, the war with India's war with Pakistan, 71. Is that right? Is it 71? Okay. So preceding that, remember, after India's partition, Bangladesh was East Pakistan, and it was ruled by Pakistan. And a fundamental problem was everyone in Pakistan spoke Urdu. Everyone in East Pakistan spoke mostly Bengali. And that was the root of a huge problem that was to follow. Now, that partition was made, and Prashanto, thank you for this. It'll give an opportunity to share a little bit of this with our broader audience. I think it's worth understanding, because it speaks to the problem of personal freedom, religious freedom, linguistic freedom, etc. So what happened is that there was a movement in East Pakistan for freedom from Pakistani administration. All the administration was from West Pakistan. So basically East Pakistan was being ruled remotely from what we now call Pakistan. And then there was a bit of a revolt that took place, at first quite modestly, but Pakistan's response was to put down that revolt very viciously. And they sent plane loads of army members, fully armed. They showed up in Bangladesh, and they showed the story, if I remember right. They showed up on a college campus, which was like the hub of the early protests, and started shooting college students and teachers, just like that. And then it continued. It got much worse from that. After that, the resistance got more strong. Pakistan sent more. There were some really, really brutal things going over, and a very complicated situation in those days. This is where, by the way, just the end of the story is that India was supporting the resistance movement in Bangladesh. Pakistan didn't like that, so Pakistan attacked India, and India responded very vigorously, and in a very brief period of time, they invaded East Pakistan. They conquered, not the right word, anyway, they were successful in capturing the Pakistani army people, and they put down this whole problem. That's when Bangladesh became free. This is the backstory. The story that Prashanto is referring to right now is much more complex, because Bangladesh is this is what I learned from my reading, a very complex society. First of all, people who lived, this is just after the war, people who lived there, they identified first and foremost as Bangladeshis, not as Hindu and Muslim. So for that reason, there was very little communal violence early on. In India, of course, in fact, throughout the partition, there was a lot of communal violence, mostly between Hindus and Muslims. And in Bangladesh, maybe there was less, because they were more identified culturally as being cultural Bengalis. But then after the war, there were, anyway, the leader of the resistance movement was assassinated. It was just, I feel bad. Prashanto, I feel bad. People who have lived in Bangladesh have really, really suffered. And to be very clear, the Hindus have suffered more. The Hindus were always a minority. I think in the day right after the war, there might have, I don't remember the numbers, might have been 30%, 40%, I don't remember, maybe 30 or less percent Hindus. And then what happened is because Hindus were in a minority, and depending on the government that was ruling, sometimes the government would protect the Hindus, sometimes the government wouldn't protect the Hindus, and there's been a constant flow of Hindus out of Bangladesh up to our current time. So they went from, I don't know if these numbers are right, from maybe 20, 30% Hindu to right now it's probably like under 10%, 7%, something. So this whole flow of Hindus out of Bangladesh because of that. Some of you know that the current government, the prior government was overthrown, as Prashanto says, and I'm sorry if I'm boring you, but I find this to me, I found this story was very compelling when you see the amount of suffering that went on. Enough suffering to drive millions of Hindu Bangladeshis to drive them out. That's how bad it was. And the government that was overthrown was probably corrupt, as many governments are corrupt, but at least it did try to, it tried to be secular, so that the Hindus wouldn't be so persecuted. Christians also persecuted in Bangladesh. Of course, all this goes on in Pakistan as well. You might know. Anyway, let me finish this up. After the prior government was deposed, the new government, there's always a government in opposition, so the opposition steps in, and the opposition apparently is not committed to protecting Hindus. And Hindus are now subject to much more communal abuse than they had been. The prior government was in place for quite a long time, so there was at least some modest amount of protection for Hindus, and that protection has been decreased. My question is, this is Prashanto's question, how can we as Hindus react to this appalling situation while facing systematic discrimination? I don't have an answer. I don't know. If I were a Hindu living in Bangladesh, I would be miserable. And my heart goes out to Prashanto and all the Hindus living in Bangladesh. And I usually don't go off on political topics like that. I've done this here because this is my way of being supportive to Hindus in Bangladesh, just by educating all the, our students here in New Jersey and all those who watch this video. Perhaps if we are all more aware of the problems going on, perhaps in one way or the other, we can contribute to our individual governments putting pressure on the Bangladeshi government to be more protective of their minority populations, which includes both Hindus and Christians. Okay. I apologize for the long political thing, but I really felt it was important. Actually, there's a related question. Actually, we'll come to that. It'll come. This is a question from Gordon. Doesn't say where he lives. When responding to a previous question, you said an enlightened person could still suffer in a dream. So it depends on, we actually in our prior class we had the discussion, who suffers? An enlightened person is one who says, I am pure consciousness. Pure consciousness doesn't suffer in a dream. Suffering takes place, absolutely. The mind of an enlightened person is still subject to nightmares. So in that sense, suffering can take place in a dream. But really speaking, the enlightened person is Satchidananda Atma, consciousness, which isn't affected by anything in the dream. Anyway, Gordon goes on to say, this touched on a misgiving I have that's troubled me for decades, that enlightenment could be reversed by senility or some kind of, we'll say some kind of trauma to the brain. We'll put it like that. Can you, if you are enlightened, can dementia or brain injury rob you of enlightenment? We talked about this in a prior class. For our online viewers, let me give you a summary of what we discussed. As I just said, from the standpoint of consciousness, consciousness was never in a state of bondage. Consciousness doesn't get enlightened. Consciousness doesn't need Vedanta. Consciousness is Satchidananda Atma and unchanging. Unchanging consciousness does not get enlightened. And an enlightened person is one who says, I am that consciousness. So from that standpoint, even if an enlightened person... I gave that metaphor. I thought that was kind of interesting. I said in the class, and this is for the benefit of the online viewers, I said in the class, if an enlightened person loses his legs, can they walk? No. If an enlightened person loses his brain, can't think because of brain injury, dementia. So if an enlightened person loses his legs, he can't walk. If an enlightened person loses the brain, he can't think. That's the human condition. And what does it mean to consciousness? Nothing at all. So we understand that if an enlightened person has a body and mind, you can't ignore that. Whatever happens to the body and mind happens to the body and mind and not the consciousness. This is a proper Vedantic understanding. He goes on a little bit. Is it possible to state the value of a spiritual quest for moksha without recourse to belief in reincarnation? We also discussed this in a prior class. We said that in many Vedantic texts, even those of Shankaracharya, there's a real emphasis on not getting reborn. But for modern Vedantic students, do you study Vedanta because you don't want to get reborn? I bet that's not your motivation. It was a common motivation in Shankara's time. It's not a primary motivation in our post-scientific times. There's a cultural shift, which is why our emphasis is not on what happens when we die. Our emphasis is on what happens now. And that is, you can be free from suffering now. And that freedom from suffering is Jivan Mukti, it's enlightenment while you're alive, and that indeed is our focus, that is our goal. Not our goal in modern times is not so much focused on Videha Mukti, which means freedom from rebirth. Okay, next question from Arun. How are dreams conjured up in sleep? Are they merely outcomes of neurochemical activities of the brain, or is it an experiential proof of a larger, more subtle dimension of existence? Which is to say, this is not taught in Vedanta. In fact, I don't think this teaching is present in any Hindu tradition. You will find it in occult traditions elsewhere. And that teaching is that your subtle body in sleep gets merged into a cosmic subtle body. If that sounds foreign to you, it should, because that's not at all what Vedanta teaches, and I'm not aware of any mainstream Hindu sampradaya, teaching tradition, that teaches this. But in some occult traditions outside of the mainstream Hinduism, they teach that when you sleep, your subtle body merges somehow with a cosmic subtle body, and you gain access to this cosmic subtle body. This is, to me, it's all it's all part of a belief system. So it's a belief system, and when I call it a belief system, it means you can't prove it, you can't disprove it, but I would suggest that there's no scientific evidence for such a thing, very little personal evidence for such a thing. If somebody says, oh, I experienced aliens in deep sleep, well, no doubt they experienced aliens in deep sleep, but were those aliens experienced, did they really exist in another dimension? Or are they merely the product of your brain's imagination? What's interesting, how would you prove one or the other? Prove it. If you say, oh, it's merely the result of the brain and mind, prove it. You can't prove it. If you say, oh, it's real, there are really aliens in another dimension, okay, prove it. We can't prove this stuff. But what I can tell you is there's nothing that I'm aware of in the Hindu tradition that supports that at all. In fact, again and again, what the texts tell us, the Sanskrit scriptures tell us again and again, that your dreams are the product of memory and imagination. That's what they all say. Okay, next. Shall we take a question here? Yeah, there's a question here. We'll take some. Let's see here.
Thank you for the opportunity. Going back to the theme of illumination and moksha, we established that Atma is unchanging, so it doesn't become illuminated. Who becomes illuminated is ahankara, the ego. It's a process that it goes through.
By illuminated, you mean enlightened.
Enlightened.
Right.
Sorry. Exactly. That's the. We understand that the ego is a construct in order to operate in the world.
Correct.
Right. And in the previous class, we were mentioning Shukti, Yukti, Anubhava. So one thing that I would just like to clarify, the first thing is that there's the cognitive discovery, the first step, and then there's I think you mentioned, which was the knowledge.
Recognition.
The recognition. That's all done by the ego, because Atma already knows everything.
Let's say it takes place in the mind.
Maybe that's the nuance that I'm missing. And
so the ego is not thank you. This one. I think this has to do with how we understand ahankara, ego. And the ego is not an independent entity running around inside of your head. It's not an independent agent. It is one aspect of the tremendous capacity of your mind. And that ego, we use the term ego or ahankara to describe certain aspects of the mind, most importantly, identity. When you say, who am I? Your sense of I-ness, your sense of who you are is associated with that ego. We would also say that the ego is it's the source of agency. This is going to address your question, but it's a little complicated. Let's see if you can get this. I think you're looking at ego as an independent agent. And what in Vedanta we understand is that ego indeed is the root of agency, but it's not an independent character in your mind. It's not like, oh, I didn't do it, my ego did it. I'm being a little facetious to make the point. And we wouldn't make that kind of differentiation. There's no separate agent called ego, but ego is indeed the source of agency. And I'm being very splitting hairs right now. Do you want to follow on?
Yeah. So, because the same concept can be applied to the mind then, when we get the whole, which is, so the mind is the one going through the process of eliminating. So the first thing that I want to clarify is that the recognition from the mind's point of view is a lot based on anubhava, which is the experience, because the
Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. You don't pick one. That is, recognition of your true nature as Satchidananda Atma requires all three. It's a recognition that you are, first of all, the recognition is beyond all three. The recognition is just, this, we get in trouble with this line of thought, and here's the problem. Your consciousness is already unchanging, already Satchidananda Atma. So then what does self-recognition mean if that consciousness is already present in this, listen, that consciousness is already present right now in this ordinary experience. Do you recognize that you are conscious? Yes. So then what do we even mean by the term self-recognition? Self-recognition is a term we use for the sake of indicating removal of ignorance with regard to your true nature. So knowledge, this is based on the very simple premise, knowledge destroys ignorance. There is a kind of ignorance that prevents you from understanding fully your true nature as consciousness. You understand you are conscious, but you don't know that that consciousness is limitless, all-pervasive, not stuck in your head, unchanging, unscathed by human problems, etc., etc. So that aspect of your true nature is as though covered by ignorance. So then we use the term self-recognition to describe a particular kind of knowledge that removes ignorance about your true nature. And let me make one more point about this word self-recognition. We use this term all the time, but we always use it in context. And the context is this: consciousness is already present in your experience. So we don't want to mix up self-recognition and experience. Consciousness is already present in your experience. So we use then self-recognition as gaining the particular kind of knowledge that destroys ignorance about your true nature. Do you want to continue now?
My last comment is that because conscience is already included, the self-recognition comes from the mind, not from conscience. Conscience already knows.
Ignorance is in the mind. The ignorance that's in the mind is removed. Yes.
Okay.
Good?
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take another question here.
So, like, sometimes how do we really even know? So, like, sometimes I feel like I've made that recognition, but then when I get extreme anxiety, I realize that I haven't made that recognition, but then I keep getting deluded thinking that I am enlightened. But so how do you, like, differentiate if you are or if you're not, and like if you made that recognition really, or if you haven't really made it?
Is it important to have a label? I am enlightened. I am almost enlightened. I am on the road to enlightenment. I am 10% of the way there. I am 20% of the way there. I'm 50%. So anyway, this kind of analysis is not particularly helpful. What you're going through is normal. Everyone starts off with first of all, we all start off ignorant. How about this? We are all equally blessed with ignorance. Just to be a little silly about it. And then we spend our lifetimes crawling out of that ignorance. And, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes proper guidance, and everyone has a different journey, everyone has a different experience. But one thing is true, is we all start off in the same place, and the place we start off with is a place of ignorance, right? Okay, let me take some more questions here. There are a bunch, and this one is interesting. This is from a group of followers from Gulmohar Orchids, Pune. This is at Gulmohar Orchid Society in Pune. Look at this. I'm glad you can. By the way, I'm glad you can. He speaks very frankly, and I like that. He says, some of your remarks on contemporary geopolitics made us write this question. We have found, by the way, I'm not sure we really represents a society. I have a feeling we probably represents the person who's writing this email, and that's fine, and that's absolutely fine. So I'm going to assume that I'm speaking to the writer of this email. We have found you becoming quite emotional while mentioning about geopolitics, and it is your grief on the suffering of human beings, yet it sounds like you are taking one side of the aggrieved parties. In geopolitics, one can decide the timeline which suits their argument. I need to precede this. He's making a reference to a recent time when I expressed my sadness about what's happening in Gaza, about the terrible carnage going on in Gaza. And let's be very clear, I didn't criticize any government or anyone for causing that carnage. I didn't point my finger. I didn't criticize anyone or anything. I merely responded to the loss of life and misery in Gaza. So, was I taking sides? And he goes, in geopolitics, one can decide the timeline which suits their argument and stamp one party as the oppressor and the other side as victims. I didn't stamp anyone as being an oppressor. I didn't make any reference at all. We are not suggesting how you express your views, but while you talk about, we are not suggesting how shall you express your views, but while you speak about kids suffering in Gaza, we have not heard you speaking about innocent women being raped on October 7th. I don't recall if I mentioned it in class or not, but I certainly felt the same kind of sadness. On October 7th, when Israel was attacked, quite unexpectedly, I felt the same. Whether or not I mentioned it in class, I don't know, but I felt the same sadness. When Israelis are attacked, when Palestinians are attacked, I feel sad. That's not taking sides. I'm not against Israel. I'm not against Hamas. I'm not against Hezbollah. I'm not against Iran. I'm not against anyone. I'm against himsa. This is a Hindu perspective. My stand, if it is a stand, is there should be no warfare. There should be no killing people. And I've mentioned many times, the situation there is so complex. In fact, I've actually educated myself a lot on the history of the Middle East to understand how that all happened. And to be honest, I've been mostly a supporter. If I've made any comments at all, most of those, at least years ago, those comments would have been supportive of Israel, if I made any at all. And I feel support for Israel as a country, as an oppressed religion, and all of that is true. But that's not my stand. My stand is based on ahimsa. So, regretfully, in Palestine, Israel, or Russia, Ukraine, while your worries regarding human suffering are genuine, it is also evident that you stand with one side. And I'm not sure how you get that. I made comments long ago about Ukraine. Who was the aggressor? Is it not a fact that the aggressor was Russia? Does it mean that 100% of the blame lies with Russia? By the way, even then, I didn't take a stand. I recognized the fact that Russia was the aggressor, but I didn't say it's all Russia's fault. I do my best not to take a stand. And because I'm teaching not only my students here in New Jersey, but I'm teaching all of you who watch these videos online. And I truly want to respect your individual cultural and political leanings. In fact, because of the variety of political leanings, I can't make any mention about our election in this country. I have opinions, but I won't mention those opinions because I don't want to hurt anyone. So I refrain as much as I can from making such opinions because as much as I can, I want to respect every individual's opinion. It's not my job as a teacher of Vedanta to change how you feel about geopolitics. There are plenty of people out there who will try to change your mind. That's not my job. My job is to is to teach you Vedanta. I have a feeling that this, to view me as taking sides, seems to reflect the incredible divisiveness we see in cultures around the world. The moment you say something, you are placed in a box, and then which is different from the other box. We get labeled. Are you Democrat or Republican? Are you this or are you that? Are you conservative or are you liberal? And I think this divisiveness leads to this kind of observation. So I hope you can all understand. I do my best not to take a stand on geopolitics, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to respond to the horrors that we see every day. And what continues in Gaza is a horror. There are a gazillion reasons for that, but nothing I have said has been critical or is taking sides. Anyway, I think we have spent enough time on that topic. But thank you for being open with your opinion. I hope my response was helpful. Next, from Sajit, who lives in Dubai. How are we doing with time? Fine. Self-recognition, to come back to your question. Self-recognition is accomplished with the faculty of mind, intelligence. All of these faculties are limited. With this limited faculty of the mind, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, with a limited mind, how can we gain knowledge of limitless Brahman? I'm paraphrasing. So, and that's a good question. And that is, how can the mind reach beyond everything? I'm trying to remember the passage from Taittiriya Upanishad. Yato, that's where it begins. And this famous passage speaks about this very difficulty. It says, and thank you for reminding me, the first word I didn't get, Yato vacho nivartante aprapya manasa saha. Famous statement that says that Brahman is that yataha from which our mind and words fall back, having failed to grasp, having failed to reach. So the Upanishads are in full agreement that our minds are indeed limited and cannot grasp that which is limitless. Fortunately, we don't have to. And that's the Vedantic solution to this, is how can you gain Brahma Jnanam, knowledge of Brahman, knowledge of the Supreme? Lots of, that's, especially in the Ramakrishna mission, they like that expression, Supreme Brahman. We would use terms as Nirguna Brahman, qualityless Brahman. How can the mind grasp that? Absolutely impossible, because it's not something out there in the world that you can grasp. The kind of funny statement they make in Hindi, in Brahman, aur ek cheez nahi. And Brahman is not one more thing out there in the world someplace that you have yet to discover. It's not like that. Then how can you, if Brahman is not out there waiting to be discovered, and if Brahman is a supreme reality that your mind will never grasp, then how is knowledge of Brahman possible? There's only one way, and it's this. The consciousness present in your experience right now, which you can discover personally and personally verify that that consciousness is boundaryless, limitless, full, complete, utterly unaffected by the world. You can discover and verify that for yourself. And when that verification is complete, you will understand that that consciousness is Brahman. The reality because of which you exist is identical to the reality because of which everything else exists. Which kind of makes sense, right? You exist because of a different reality than everything else? It's silly. There's one underlying reality. In terms of your experience, that underlying reality is consciousness. But from another standpoint, that same truth is Brahman. The consciousness because of which you exist is identical to Brahman. One of the four main Mahavakyas, Prajnanam Brahma, says Brahman is consciousness. So to summarize all of that, Brahman can only be known as your true self. I'll say that one more time because that conveys the whole thing. Brahman can be known, not by grasping at something far away, not by discovering it somewhere, someplace, but Brahman can be known as the truth of who you are. That's the idea. Okay, but good question. Next, let's see, from Animesh in Bengal. We already know that sannyasis don't consume onion and garlic since they're considered aphrodisiac. I don't know if they're aphrodisiac. They're stimulating. Anyway, aphrodisiac, I don't know about that. But they're basically rajasic is what. By the way, what I have to tell you that what happens is when you stop eating this food, those kinds of food, then if you're not used to it, it just stinks. If you're used to it, it's you may enjoy that. But if you're not used to it, it's like, what is that smell? Ick. Anyway, so sannyasis as generally do not take onion and garlic because of rajasic. It's considered to be a minor obstacle to spiritual growth. So Animesh's question, should we as normal students of Advaita Vedanta, means householders, should we also give up onion and garlic? If you don't enjoy onion and garlic, you should definitely give. There are Animesh, I understand the question, but there are so many more important things in spiritual life than diet. Diet should be the least. In fact, I would say what's more important is having a healthy diet. If I think onion and garlic, I can't eat them, but if you really are attracted to them, I think that's less harmful to eat onion garlic than it is to eat too much sugar and fat. Seriously. Too much sugar and fat will hurt you a lot more than onion and garlic. On the other hand, if you already have a healthy diet and you want it to be even better, even more suitable for spiritual growth, then definitely, if you feel inclined, you can give up onion garlic. Okay. Next question. Let me take one more and then we'll see if there's other questions here. This is from Neil, who lives in Atlanta. Neil asks, how do we deal with moments of spiritual discouragement? I try so hard to study, learn, practice, and grow on a spiritual journey, but then all of a sudden, in a moment of weakness, I sometimes just stumble, either in anger or something, and then I feel so disappointed in myself, and I regret what I said or done. I feel like I take 2 steps forward, only to take 2 steps back. Wow, I relate to this so much. And Neil, I'm not sure if you remember, I've told this story several times of when I was a student at my guru's ashram. This would be in the late 1980s, and absolutely immersed in these teachings. And we were a group of maybe 60, 70 students living together, working together, studying together. And when you have a group of people together like that, sometimes conflicts happen. And indeed, I just can't remember the situation at all, but I remember having a really nasty argument with someone. And I remember feeling exactly as Neil describes here. Spiritual discouragement, he describes it very well, because here I am at an ashram dedicating my life to spiritual growth, and I can't even avoid an argument. It's like, what's wrong with me? Have I not made any progress at all? Have I not made any has my efforts been wasted? So, and that happened to me many times, not just once. That I admit, it happened to me many times. So, Neil, I definitely relate to this. And two things I recall from those events. One is, you know what? I remember I used to keep a journal in those days. And I remember writing this, and I don't know why I remember this part in particular. I remember writing that I was so depressed. After one such incident, I was so disgusted with myself and so depressed. I wrote in the journal that I am in a fire of self-purification. I took my self-disgust and depression as being a metaphoric fire of self-purification, which would help me avoid making that mistake again. So that was by the way, that's not the final perspective, that's an intermediate perspective. So I acknowledged the intensity of my negative reaction, and I did, I guess what we would call, I put a positive spin on it, to use modern language. Psychologically, though, that's not particularly healthy. To treat yourself as an enemy. I've spoken about this several times. To make an enemy of your mind, and to blame your mind, and to this self-deprecation comes in, which is psychologically harmful. Self-deprecation, to put yourself down. I'm an idiot, I'm a jerk, why am I still behaving like this? That is psychologically harmful. Yes, I put a positive spin on it in those days, but I eventually learned that putting myself in a fire of purification was not the best way to handle those situations. I learned to become more gentle with myself and recognize that we all make mistakes. It's that simple. Who among us haven't made terrible blunders? And to make this more vivid, we all have a few years left to live. We're likely to make several more terrible blunders while we're still alive. We have time. There's still time. We'll make a few more terrible blunders. This is the human condition. The human condition is this. And this is where my early response was that fire of self-purification. As I said, that was intermediate. Where I arrived at years later was this. We all do the best we can based on where we are in the present moment. What else can we do? In every situation, we do the best we can. Sometimes it's not enough, but it's the best we can. At that time, in that situation, all we can do is the best we can. So with that perspective, I was a little more gentle with myself, no more that fire of purification was a little intense, and I think that's what Neil has been through. So Neil, I would encourage you to adopt this latter point of view, and that is, you did the best you can in those situations. A year from now, this is the good part. No matter what mistakes we've made recently, we'll do better a year from now. We'll do better a year after that, and a year after that. Every year we're going to get better and better. That's guaranteed. Since you are on a path of spiritual growth, I guarantee, not I, but based on psychology and based on these teachings, you will do better next year, etc., etc. Okay, a question here. You'll need the microphone.
I'm so sorry, but I have a question. Especially about that, I don't know if I have to speak, but what I felt I want to say. You mentioned about that geopolitics question, and I clearly remember the last month before meditation, you have mentioned that whole scenario, and you arrived at the conclusion that there is no single party to be blamed, and you came from Middle East to UK and then UN. And then from UN to all of us are responsible for that situation. So I really wanted to say that today, because the question was today. And I have a question also.
Yeah, go ahead, please. That's nice that you remember that.
No, because I said, how can you think about Swamiji like that? You know? I mean, this was my first reaction.
Okay.
Then my question is no different than these two gentlemen asked. And today also you explained, but I understand verbally or by words, but I did not understand really. That's what I would say. And the question is, you mentioned about shift in consciousness and cognition of shift in consciousness.
I didn't use the term shift of consciousness. I said there is a cognitive shift and there's a shift of identity.
Shift of
There's a shift of cognition and a shift of identity.
But I did not
go ahead, please.
I did not understand the difference between the two. That's my question.
Okay.
Like shift in identity and cognition shift in identity.
Okay.
I don't understand.
Okay. That's. I'm glad you asked that question. That was a very sophisticated discussion. So the fact that you don't understand it is hardly surprising. It's not easy for anyone to understand these subtle distinctions, but at a certain point in our process of self-inquiry, these distinctions become important. They're absolutely unimportant early on. Later, they become important. So let me try to answer the question. What I said was that to merely undergo a cognitive shift is not enough. First of all, what is a cognitive shift? So we all start off thinking, I am this body, mind, sense complex. Then, after going through enough of these Vedantic teachings and after doing enough self-inquiry, we come to realize, oh, I was wrong. I'm not. My essential nature, let me put it in these terms. I have a body, I am not the body. Just like I have clothes, I possess clothing, I'm not what I possess. I possess a body, I'm not what I possess. I possess thoughts, I'm not what I possess. I possess emotions. I am different from all of that. I am the conscious being who is aware of all that. I recognize that my true nature is as a conscious being who is aware of all of these possessions. That I described as a cognitive shift. And that cognitive shift is crucial in Advaita Vedanta. If that cognitive shift doesn't come, progress stops. Your progress in spiritual growth comes to a complete stop until you can make that cognitive shift. Until you can see that I am not this body, I am not this mind, I am consciousness, my true nature is consciousness. That's the cognitive shift. I said it's not enough because in spite of that cognitive shift, there's a problem. I'm going to use a little different language than I used earlier in class. Many of you were in the class. I'll use a little different language. And that is to say, in spite of that cognitive shift, there remains habitual identification with your body and mind. In fact, this is language I've used before on several occasions. That is, you have been identified with your body and mind since infancy. And that identification is very deeply embedded in your mind. And today, neuroscience tells us it's actually physically present in your brain. That's what they tell us now. And they can show how that's so. And that is these deep, deep impressions of thoughts and feelings literally affect our physical brains. So here's a way to understand it. When you get that cognitive shift, that I am not the body and mind, I'm Satchidananda Atma, does that immediately rewire your brain? Does it immediately remove decades and decades and decades of habitual thinking? So therefore, what remains is a second kind of shift. A second kind of shift, and I called it a shift of identity, a shift in which this habitual identification with the body and mind is gradually removed, and what remains is an identification with my true nature as Satchidananda Atma. That when the identification shifts in that way, we call that an enlightened ego. An enlightened ego, actually maybe I'm unnecessarily complicating it by calling it an enlightened ego, but we talked about that before. Earlier, I defined myself in terms of my body and mind. After the shift of identity, I define myself as pure consciousness. So that's a shift of how you feel about yourself. That's a nice way of putting it. How do you feel about yourself? Well, different people will respond. Some people go and look in the mirror and okay. Or they'll say, wee. Of course, that's with regard to your body. What about with regard to your mind? Where is it coming from? Om, 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 om. I hear that little buzz. Anyway. Or with regard to your mind, like Neil in his question about making mistakes in life and blunders in life. So therefore, how do you feel about yourself physically? How do you feel about yourself as a psychological being? An enlightened person doesn't care. Look in the mirror, who cares? Seriously, who cares? We all look funny. That's a conclusion I've come to over the year. We all look funny, and as I said earlier, we've all made terrible mistakes, and we've got a few years left, and we'll make a few more terrible mistakes. So that really is, to me, that is the shift of identity we're after. It's not merely to know that I am Satchidananda Atma, but to be able to look in the mirror and say, who cares? To be able to look, in fact, let me end with this. This is kind of an important point. So to be able to look in the mirror, you get that point with regard to the body. I think a more interesting, more important aspect is to be able to look back on your own life, to look at the terrible blunders you've made, and not to blame yourself. Because you did the best you could at that time under those circumstances. What that means is you're not holding on to responsibility for everything your mind does. Tell me, are you personally responsible for are you 100% responsible for the funny appearance of your body? Partially, but fully responsible? Blame your parents, grandparents, etc., etc. You have to go back generations. So you get that. You are not fully responsible. The same goes true. The same holds true for your mind, and in particular, the blunders we've all made in the past. An enlightened person looks back and says, I was young and stupid back then, and that's why I behaved in that manner. I did the best I could, the best anyone as young and stupid as I was. That's all that could be managed at the time. Now, the key point here is there's no holding on to personal responsibility. That's what hurts. When we blame ourselves and we fail to see it as natural. And I'll end with this point. So many things we do that are natural are not very pleasant. And an example I've given many times before is infants aren't bathroom trained. Boy, what a mess! But that's completely natural, is it not? Infants, they do the best they can. As they're being trained, then they try and they make mistakes. I'm sure parents must get frustrated going through all that. The children, they do the best they can. Well, tell me, isn't that a good metaphor for all of us? What a metaphor. We're all trying to get potty trained. You get the idea? Is that we are constantly improving ourselves, but we have those mistakes that happen every now and then. Okay, I think that's a good place to stop for today. Thank you for joining our satsang. We'll continue next week. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinaha sarve santu niramayaha sarve bhadrani pashyantu ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om. That's it. See you next time.